Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program, presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Gerges, the Deputy Director of the Department of Military History.
Don't turn this off, right? Hello. Well, good afternoon, everybody. What a great turnout today. The person I'm going to introduce should be no stranger to you all. He's normally the one up here doing the introductions, and that is our director, Sean Kalic. Sean joined the Department of Military History in 2004 as one of our first as we started bringing civilians on board, and he has worked his way up through the school. First an instructor, and then a curriculum developer, then becoming our master instructor until he was finally selected this spring as the director of the Department of Military History. He has his numerous degrees, but he got his PhD through Kansas State. He's a Cold War historian. He has written a number of books, including about the militarization of space and presidents and policies and about spies. And so tonight he's eminently qualified to talk about Vladimir Putin. Thank you.
All the other wartime leaders are talking about folks that had to deal with their country being attacked. And for some reason, I'm talking about the guy who starts the wars. So it's going to be a bit of a different kind of dynamic, I think, because number one, we're still in the middle of a Russian-Ukraine war. So we'll talk about Putin, who he is, how he grew up, influences on his life, the Second Chechen War, some wars around Georgia, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and then ultimately Ukraine. So about 45 minutes, and then I'll leave it open for some questions. The problem is I'm a historian, so I don't know what's going to happen, right? So usually 20 years after it happens, we tell you what it means. So if you have contemporary questions about how's it going to end, I'll do my best to give you an insightful answer, but those answers are mine, and mine alone by no means do they represent the Army, Department of Defense, or the U.S. government in any way, okay? I think we have to start with thinking about Putin in a kind of a contextual framework. The context of empire is that you'll hear folks talk about Putin and his influences, that he's an ex-czar, he's an ex-Stalin, and I think the reality is he's probably a little bit of both. And we'll talk about why in a second, but I think the reality is you need to think about Russia as an entity, both in the Tsarist regime, there in the multicolor one, and then ultimately in the USSR. And I think Putin's, one of the things that drives Putin and his ideas is really about reestablishing Russia as a significant regional power, if not a major world power. And whether it's the Russian context or the Soviet context, part of it is the 1990s and the implosion of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, I think, have a profound impact. So don't forget these maps, and then I'm going to lay on a few other maps, mainly NATO, which is going to have another impact, which is going to change this dynamic. But I think his mindset is really about reestablishing some sense of Russian greatness, okay? Which we can talk whether he wants to be a czar or a dictator, but the reality is probably somewhere in between. The next point is, as I was putting this together, I kept thinking about that old game show, will the real Vladimir Putin please stand up? I've done a fair amount of research on previous Russian leaders, but not contemporary ones. So I'm good with the Cold War, Stalin, all those characters, right? But Putin is a different kind of animal, it seems. And we'll talk about how he kind of emerges in the 1990s and 2000s and seems to be kind of an okay guy that maybe we can do business with, and all of a sudden it just starts to kind of get tainted over time. But if you look up on the screen, there's kind of various personalities. You have Putin, the kind of president, the statesman who wants to be taken seriously and is taken seriously by folks from George W. Bush all the way down to Angela Merkel, to China, to Kim in North Korea. But on the other side, you also have Putin, the great sportsman, right? The guy who hunts bears, bare-chested, drives Formula One race cars, dives and finds magical pottery at the end of in the bottom of oceans just because it happens to be there. No, it's probably planted. But we'll talk about that too. And we have a judo champion as well, who's been practicing judo since he's been about 10 to 12 years old. So the idea is that he's not just a man of action, he's also an intellect too. Now on the other side, we have, for the last row, we kind of have Putin, the military man. Putin did not serve in the military. He was a KGB officer, and we'll talk about that too. But the reality is he has a profound impact of making sure that people understand that he also is a vital part of this military machine. And the question then becomes, which one is the real Putin? And the reality is they all seem to be. And part of putting this together is there's not a whole lot of background on Putin. I mean, there's books written on him, but there are large gaps in time and space. We'll talk about his young life, which there's kind of the birth, and then he goes off to university, and there's a whole lot of emptiness in between, and then there's other emptiness as we go forward. And a lot of this has been sanitized, by the way, by Putin and the regime, which we can talk about why that is at the end if we need to. But the reality is that I think these three elements still drive Putin, and we need to think about that geopolitical context that I talked about in the beginning and how he sees Russia. He sees Russia as a substantial international player in world resources. As a military power, they have a sizable nuclear weapons cache, holdover from the Cold War. They've been slowly updating and maintaining since the end of the Cold War. They are, well, at one point they had significant economic means, which have been withering since the invasion of Ukraine, and one could argue since the 1990s. But the reality is I think he's searching for a place on how do you rebuild Russia and maintain, again, Russian greatness. That's kind of a simple solution, but we can talk and discuss that as we go through. But I think that's what's driving him. And we can talk about how Ukraine fits into this and all those other things, but the reality is I think it's a different speech today simply because he's the guy making war. He wants to achieve something which is a bigger, greater Russia. He wants some respect, and whatever he has to do to use it or earn it, he will do it. And we can talk about some ideas about how do you treat a guy who seemingly wants respect, and also you can't back him into a corner because that makes him somewhat dangerous. And that's the other part of this, is that I'm a big fan of George F. Kennan, former head of the policy planning staff, and comes up with a policy of containment. And one of his points about studying Russian, he's a Russianist in the 1920s, probably the foremost expert in the United States on the Soviet Union and Russia. And one of his positions as he's talking about what we need to do in the early Cold War is that he highlights the fact that you should never back Russian leaders into a corner. You always need to leave them a way out, and a way out that allows them to save face and at least claim some form of victory. And what we'll see with Putin is that he starts out as seemingly a pretty reasonable guy. As we get deeper and deeper into time, once we get to Ukraine, that those positions start to solidify. The nice guy seems to go away, and the world seems to be creeping in on him, and that's not a good place for a guy who may have some I don't want to say inferiority complexes, but, wants Russia to be great again. And, are we risking a bigger conflagration in Europe if we keep pushing him into a corner? And I think that is something we can discuss as we move through the wars that he perpetuates. Okay, some biography. A lot to read. The main 4 photos up there are the only things you can kind of find of Putin as a kid. Pictures of his parents show up, and I'll talk about his parents. But the reality is, it's interesting as you read books on Putin that he wrote his own autobiography, which is intriguing. It doesn't seem to jibe with a lot of other stuff from the West, by the way. But it's worth a read, right? And it's coming from the source. But it's also this idea that when you read a lot of the biographers, they talk about how he has worked very hard to manipulate and perpetuate this very scaled front of a man who kind of came from nothing and built himself up from, a small kind of anemic kid in Leningrad to one of the world's great leaders. And I think that is something else that is driving Putin here. Now, his parents, Vladimir Spinodonovich Putin, was born in 1911, died in 1999, which is unique in the fact that usually Russian lifespans are relatively small, especially if you have to live through 2 world wars, which he did. So he dies in 1999. He was in the Soviet Navy during the First War as a submariner, and then gets transferred to the NKVD, which is like border patrol, and then ends up in the Soviet Army, where he's substantially wounded, and then ends up with kind of a low-level government job after that. His mother, Maria Ivanova Putina, is a factory worker. So in the context of the Soviet system, he comes from good Soviet stock, right? A factory worker and a servant of the Red Army that has sacrificed in the Great Patriotic War. So what better could you use to ascend greatness than this awesome Russian idea, right? Now, this is the interesting part if you look up there. 1952, he's born. 1975, all of a sudden, he goes to university. That is not because I ran out of space on the slide. There is not a whole lot of detailed information about what happens in his young life. In fact, there's even significant discussion that his parents, which are listed, may actually be foster parents. In fact, there's a whole discussion about, there was a woman who came out about 10 years ago who said, I gave him up for adoption, and he was adopted. Those were his adopted parents. And that has been substantially squashed, and still there's significant doubt in the West what the true story is. Putin will say, no, these are my parents. Here's where I come from. But it's also a very convenient story because they sacrificed through Leningrad, the siege of Leningrad. He's actually the third child of his parents. His first brother passes away in the 1920s. His second brother is going to pass away as an infant during the siege of Leningrad. So if you're crafting a story, again, image and reality merge into fiction and fantasy. It's a fantastic, great story, right? That he perseveres in the wreckage of Leningrad as a kid, and there's stories about him being a bit ostracized from the other children, and playing with rats and scrounging for food in the demolished city of Leningrad. And if you don't know anything about Leningrad, it's one of the longest sieges in modern warfare history. So the nation the city has to be put back together relatively quick, and he's part of that. So if you're growing up in this period, he's having to kind of find his own way on the mean streets of Leningrad / St. Petersburg. And then in 1975, all of a sudden, he's going to graduate from Leningrad State University. And this is what I find so fascinating, is that he goes to the law department, but there's absolutely nothing in his background to indicate that he wanted to be a lawyer. And then after that, he's going to join the KGB and make his way up through the ranks. And we'll talk about that in a second. By all accounts, he seems to have a relatively, normal childhood for the Soviet perspective, right, from what we can kind of piece together. His wife is Lyudmila Alexandrinova, who he's going to marry in 1983 and eventually have 2 daughters with. He's going to later divorce her in the mid-2000s. And we can talk about that too, because again, stories and the way those merge are interesting as well. But he's going to spend the vast majority of his young professional life down there in East Germany, right, as a KGB officer. He starts out as a translator, but in the Soviet system, his official duties as translator, his real job is being a spy. And what he's trying to do is put together networks of spies that will feed information from West Germany to East Germany, but his day job in the embassy is a translator. He's going to get moved up to running operations and and what that means is putting those networks of Stasi agents and KGB agents together to gather information on what NATO's doing, what the West is doing, if and when we have to go to war. So he seemingly is doing a pretty good job in East Germany, but he's away from the flagpole, but he's getting good remarks. He's recognized by his superiors as somebody who is committed to the communist cause, which is good in the Soviet system, right? In fact, he joins the Communist Party when he goes to university in 1971, and is a diehard committed communist member until 1991, when the Soviet Union goes away, and the Communist Party kind of falls out of favor. So he's also very adept at kind of reading the political winds, it seems, too, right? So you join the party in the 70s, and the height of Brezhnev, and then as it's on its way out in 1991, you quickly drop that and move away. Now, while he's at university, he also befriends a professor who's going to have a significant impact on his life as well. Excuse me. And this is Anatoly Sobchak, who is a professor in the law department and is later in the 1990s going to help write the Russian Constitution. Now, he ends up being kind of a coach and mentor to young Putin. And what's unique is that he helps him through his undergraduate years. They really don't talk much as they're both doing their thing in the 1980s. In the 1990s, once the Soviet Union kind of is falling apart and Russia and the Russian Federation is taking off, Putin and Sobchak are going to rekindle their relationship. At first, Sobchak is going to help Putin transition from the KGB into kind of local St. Petersburg government. Right? It's not Leningrad anymore, right? St. Petersburg is old system's gone, new system, brand new name, right? Or really the old name. And then later, Putin's going to help Sobchak get the job right in the Constitution. So they're kind of working with one another and seeing if and when they can help one another move through this unique system. You can see Putin's kind of career, which, as I was putting this together, I was struck by the fact that once he resigns from the KGB in 91, he just holds a whole bunch of kind of government apparatchik jobs. And if you know anything about an apparatchik in the Soviet system, an apparatchik is just kind of like a mid-level functionary. So from a guy who's doing good things, running spy networks and on the front edge of the Cold War, it seems to me that the 1990s, at least 91 through probably 98, he's just doing kind of boring bureaucratic work. But the whole nation's in the transition period, and he's kind of feeling his way through the system, and he's going to come out looking pretty good, by the way. Mayor's office, which doesn't sound really big, but St. Petersburg is a relatively large city, so being in the mayor's office is significant. Then he's first deputy chairman, which means he's running the city government, which gives him his first taste of power. Now, also in this period, as the Soviet Union is melting away and Russia is standing up, the Russian Federation, you have a scramble for resources. So you may have heard the term oligarchs, right? And the Russian oligarchs who are working to maintain control of like oil, gas, steel production. There's some supposition that it's in this period that Putin starts to make a good name for himself by handing out favors to oligarchs. And there's also a discussion on whether Putin is a billionaire or not, and it comes from this period that, in the fine Soviet tradition, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. So if he's helping them get gas contracts for the city of St. Petersburg, or steel contracts, or electrical grid, that there's a little kickback here and there. But again, as with his younger childhood, there's no definitive answer on how much money he's worth or what he has. Folks say, no, yes, he's a billionaire legitimately, no, it's all a facade. He's just living off the state. So there's this ultimate dichotomy no matter what way you turn Putin, whether it's his young life or kind of professional life or even currently, who is the real Vladimir Putin? We just don't know. So he's working through that. The Russian region, so he's moving from St. Petersburg city government, and then all of a sudden becomes chief of staff to the Russian region, which means now he's working on a much more regionalized prospect. So it's not just city government, and then it's kind of the whole city, and now it's a region, and then he's going to get picked up. It's kind of like thinking like baseball, right? So he's working through the farm team, right? He's going to get caught up to the minors, and now Yeltsin's going to bring him up to the big leagues. But the big league first is going to be director of the FSB, which is the predecessor to the KGB, which again is interesting. So for a guy who has a whole bunch of early jobs in the 1990s that is kind of a mid-level functionary, now all of a sudden they put him right back into director of the Foreign Intelligence Service. Right? At a time when it's being rebuilt, and if we look at the contemporary FSB, it looks a lot like the old KGB with different names plastered onto it, right? And is even doing some of its work that it did in the Cold War. From there, and he seems to be a good organizer. He has the respect of FSB officers, and with that, President Yeltsin is going to pull him up to be prime minister. And this is his really first taste of kind of major national, international power. If you remember anything about the regime of Yeltsin, it starts off pretty okay with Boris Yeltsin as a happy-kind-of-go-lucky kind of guy. And then we find out that he is a raging alcoholic and has significant health problems. So the government is in shambles simply because the leader is untrustworthy and quickly declining in health. And Putin, as the prime minister, he becomes a steady hand on the tiller. He's also in a position now to help those oligarch buddies of his get even more contracts and bigger and brighter advantages for the future, okay? From there, at the end, he's going to get elected. So prime minister, which in Russia you have the president and the prime minister. Prime minister has control of the government, right? The president has control of kind of the international portion. So they work together I would argue that when he's appointed prime minister, he probably has much more control over the government than Yeltsin, simply because of Yeltsin's health and his drinking problem. So the next logical step then is, if you're prime minister, you get elected president of the Soviet Union. I'm sorry, I'll say Soviet Union probably quite a bit through this, because old habits die hard, of Russia, right? So what's going to happen now is from March 2000 on, he's either going to be president, because of the term cycle, right? And there's term limitations. So you'll see first term, right, 2001 to 2004. Second term to 2008, you can't hold a third term at this period in time, right? So then he's going to just step out and put Medvedev in. So he becomes prime minister, right? And then he can go back for another term, right? Third term and then you can manipulate the system too to allow you to do more terms. So if you look at 2000 on, Putin is actually, behind Stalin, the longest-serving head of the Russian/Soviet government. And I have some numbers just to give you a perspective, right? So Lenin formally runs the Soviet Union for about 1.5 years, because you're counting the Soviet Union about 2022. Stalin, 29 years. Khrushchev, 11 years. Brezhnev, 18. Andropov, Chernenko, 1 year apiece. Gorbachev, 6. Vladimir Putin, 25. So, again, in context, he served, by the end of his next term, just shy of our good friend Joseph Stalin, which is pretty significant. So talk about the expanse of influence, and then if you add on his period kind of from 91 on, he's probably well beyond what Stalin was doing as well. So he's definitely in charge. I don't think he's going to give up power anytime soon. And this is part of the issue, is that once you're elected here, there seems to be some significant discussions about what's happening. If we think about really the First Chechen War, which is the first war we'll talk about. So I don't even know how to get into this, because there's just so much complexity in this whole Chechen thing, right? So Chechnya is a region in the former Soviet Union that's going to break away. It has a large contingency of Muslims, and Yeltsin is the one who's going to start the first Chechen War as Chechen breaks away, right? And it gets pacified, everything seems to be kind of okay, and then all of a sudden there seems to be an influx of international radicalized Islamicists in Chechnya. And this happens to kind of coincide with Putin becoming prime minister in 99. And he's going to help Yeltsin deal with the problem. In fact, he's going to send the Russian forces into Chechnya the first time, in what becomes the Second Chechen War. So Yeltsin isn't saying yes. It's the prime minister saying yes. So again, it's going to be a Putin war, not a Yeltsin war. And the idea is you're going to go in and crush the resistance and bring Chechnya back into the fold of Russia and the new Russian Federation. If you look at the timeline, so that starts 2000. I think we all know what happens September 11th, right? 2001, right? U.S. is attacked by Al-Qaeda. Vladimir Putin is the first international leader to call President Bush, offer his condolences, and offer assistance for helping in the fight. And part of the discussion is, I too am fighting radical Islamicists in Chechnya. We have a common cause, and we should join together and fight this evil. Again, will the real Vladimir Putin please stand up, right? I mean, and a lot of folks kind of point to the fact that was this a missed opportunity? Was this Putin being fast and loose with kind of what did he want to get out of it? And the reality is he's going to offer significant assistance to the United States, specifically in the near and abroad region as we go into Afghanistan. So rights to some bases, now that's going to be later rescinded, but at this early stage, and if you go back to 2001, they're going to meet at Bush's ranch, right? Where Bush has that famous quote where I looked deep into his eyes and saw his soul, and he's a good guy, right? As they were chopping wood together down in Texas. Don't forget, will the real Vladimir Putin please stand up, right? But this seems, at least from my perspective, to be a different Vladimir Putin. He seems to be genuinely, number one, concerned about this new growing threat in the global community, radical Islam, and the need to suppress it. And he sees the attack on the United States as an opportunity, dare we say, to maybe rekindle a relationship that has somewhat soured over the 1990s. And I would argue that the First Chechen War is both a foothold into maybe a new opportunity in the 21st century, but also is predicated upon what's been going on in the 90s, which I really haven't talked about yet, which is NATO. So there's discussions about what's going to happen as the Cold War ends, and to the infrastructure, the Warsaw Pact's going to go away in NATO. And there are discussions about partnerships for peace, and how do you bring former Soviet entities into the Partnerships for Peace program and maybe expand NATO or even make NATO go away. And there's all these awesome discussions. And there may be a promise or two, kind of a gentleman's agreement between people, specifically the US and maybe, I don't know, Gorbachev, that NATO will not expand 1 inch east. Now, I have a good friend at CGSC, Mark Wilcox, who said, Sean, NATO doesn't expand, NATO enlarges itself. And it's actually expansion or enlargement. From the West, it's an enlargement. From the Soviet/Russian perspective, it's always expansion. So that discussion with really James Baker and Gorbachev that, yeah, NATO probably won't expand, everything's probably good, is remembered by the Russians at a very specific moment in time where you promised that NATO wouldn't expand and grow. So in 2001, we've gone through the 1990s, and what happens in the 1990s is NATO is going to go from this small kind of Western entity to what we see there in 2024. And in 1990, it is the first nations that get brought back in are Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland. And if you know anything about the Soviet Union, those are well within their sphere of influence. So if you were kind of following the 1990s and there's an agreement that, yeah, no expansion west, there's some issues in Bosnia and Kosovo and some other things going on. At the same time, these former Warsaw Pact countries are screaming to be part of the West. And I would argue, I don't think there's any grand strategy on the West. It's going to say, yeah, bring them in so we can kind of expand and hem the Soviet Union/Russia in. It's just a matter of fact, if Czechoslovakia wants in, oh, absolutely, that's great. Hungary wants in, absolutely, that's great. Poland wants in, because we're kind of riding high on the victory of the Cold War, and we're not paying attention to the Russian perspective, right? And if you're Putin's going to make a comment in one of his autobiographies, that one of the worst days of his life was in 1989, and he's sitting in his office in Dresden. And there are growing crowds outside his office, which is a kind of a gated kind of complex. And they're getting increasingly violent and trying to shake and break through the gate. And he's going to call KGB headquarters back in Moscow, and they essentially tell him, thanks for the information, you're on your own, it's going to pieces there. So, as a young KGB officer, hey, good luck. See you on the other side, right? I hope you can do the best for the country. It looks like the world's falling apart, right? And the Soviet Union is going to collapse after the Warsaw Pact, as a matter of fact. So if you're taking that as, okay, the once great Soviet sphere of influence, NATO in the West has pledged that it won't expand. And the reality is in the 1990s, NATO does enlarge, but there's no grand strategy on why and how it does. It just kind of naturally happens because Russia is in shambles, trying to put its economy back together, trying to get through the Yeltsin years. And by the time Putin ascends to the presidency in 2000, 2001, NATO looks like it has significantly enlarged itself to ensure that Russia stays in its place, in its proper place, a much more smaller place than it had during the Cold War. So if you're Putin and your ultimate objective is to strive to bring Russia back, it doesn't look good, right? So that feeds into that kind of, I think, concept that we need to understand kind of the Russian perspective. And again, I don't think it was any grand strategy on our part, but the reality was, from Putin's perspective, he remembers 1989. He remembers the pledge in the 90s, like 92, no expansion west, not 1 inch, and all of a sudden in 2000, I'm president, and now all of a sudden, wait a minute, you guys have now built an extension all around, and you've not only brought in Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, you've brought in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and now you're working on southern entities. Ooh, what's it look like from the Russian perspective? And I think this is part of studying the Soviet Union and Russia, that you need to kind of get into their psyche, right? That if you believe that you're a world superpower, and they were, and now all of a sudden you wake up in 2021 and you're the president, it looks like your stock's gone down a little bit. So what are you supposed to do? Oh, I'm going to make Russia great again. And part of this is slowly trying to claw back what he sees as the traditional Russian sphere of influence, which looks like either the Tsarist Empire, which is much bigger, or at minimal, the Soviet Empire. So you can start with places like, oh, maybe Georgia, right? Oh, maybe Ukraine, and we'll talk about those two wars next. It's making sense to everybody? Okay. All right, let's talk about Georgia, because there's lots of parallels, I'll argue, between Georgia and Ukraine. In fact, in looking at this and putting it together again, I think sometimes when we study history, we tend to look at things myopically. And when we zoom back, we're like, oh, wow, look at those parallels. There's a lot of parallels we're going to see between how Russia goes into Georgia and how they go into the Ukraine. All right, so if we break it up again, I put maps on to make it easier for all of us to understand. That when the Soviet Union goes away, we have Georgia, right? Not the southern Georgia peach trees, but the other Georgia on the Black Sea with Baku and lots of oil and everything, right? The Georgia where Stalin's from, by the way, right? You also have these elements of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which are going to end up being breakaway republics. And if you're Putin and trying to put things back together again, you can't have any breakaway republics. Why? Yeah, shout it out. Everyone wants, right? No one wants to be under your rule, right? So all of a sudden, you're going to have to do something significant. So really, it starts out as a Georgian problem with South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which have ethnic Russians living there. And Georgia was like, no, they're technically part of Georgia, so we'll deal with it. And Russia's like, no, they asked us to come in as peacekeepers. May sound familiar, right? But the idea that you're going there to help protect Russians, and you're going there to help protect the sanctity of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which are breakaway independent regions. And it's the Georgians who are the ones who are advocating for war and being provocative and being aggressive. We're just here to help protect the good people of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Again, it seems to be a pattern to me. I don't know, right? And you can kind of follow the timeline that, Russia begins working with the governments of South Abkhazia and Ossetia in April of 2008 about peacekeeping forces. And again, you'll see the same thing with Ukraine, right? There are significant military exchanges as this is going on, because what they're trying to do is really work on the diplomatic side. At the same time, there's border patrols solidifying the positions around South Ossetia on the South Ossetian side with the Russians, and then the Georgians who are trying to protect open and freedom of movement between those two entities, and same with Abkhazia. Now, Putin is prime minister. He's not president at this time. Medvedev is the president, technically, because this is one of his kind of off cycles, right? And then he's going to come back. And you can just kind of follow the time. It's a simple kind of ratchet up of tensions, right? That the reality is the Georgian police are trying to maintain open borders. The South Ossetians, and really the tension starts out with South Ossetia, and then Abkhazia is going to get involved as well. It's really about police actions, border control, border passport, and then the Russians are going to say, no, let's solidify that. There's artillery fire going back and forth the whole time. They finally are going to come to a ceasefire on August 10th, 2008, and Georgia's going to say, okay, we'll pull all our troops back. And then Russia says, oh, that's fine, because now we're going to launch an offensive into Georgia, by the way. So you see this idea of provocation, but justified provocation, right? Because remember, they went in as peacekeepers. And then when the conditions are significant enough where Georgia says, okay, we're going to negotiate a diplomatic way out of this, we'll pull our forces back to maintain a good faith, maintain the boundary line, Russia then says, oh, no, now it's time to attack. And now you can push those forces out into Georgia and possibly take elements of Georgia, right? August 12th, Medvedev is going to halt the Russian invasion into Georgia, and Georgia is going to pull its forces further back from Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and then 4 days later, they're going to negotiate a peace deal. But the reality is, Russian forces never leave. So although there's a peace deal that, okay, Russia won't stay and use those as staging grounds, the reality is they still maintain significant, sizable forces on the borders as border guards and peacekeeping forces. So in many ways, if you kind of follow Ukraine, this seems, at least to me, to have a lot of parallel ideas, right? Peacekeepers, right? Breakaway republics, opportunities for a quick dash to see how much land you can grab in a massive combined arms offensive, because it's not just about, troops on the ground. They're using air power, artillery, infantry to move as close as they can to Tbilisi and take the capital. Another interesting parallel, right? Now, it doesn't quite work out. They end up with a peace deal, but still it fine-tunes Putin's ideas about how and when you can use military power. So I think if you take, before you get into Ukraine, if you look at what happens in Chechnya, if you look what happens in Georgia, and you lay that over his use of military power and the use of force to achieve what you can, and then the quest to rebuild a Russian empire, Ukraine almost seems like a no-brainer. At least from the Russian perspective, right? We already talked about that. So here's the Ukraine, which is on 2 slides, because there's just so much. And I only took it up to like 22, 23, because it's changing daily now. In fact, before I came over here, I read Russian forces just broke through and may have taken a Ukrainian city, but Ukrainian forces are still up around the Kursk region. So again, historian, not contemporary military analyst, right? So Ukraine. So how do we get into Ukraine? I would argue it goes back to those same fundamentals. We need to think about NATO expansion, Putin's quest for rebuilding a Russian empire or a greater Russia. And the idea is that if you have forces like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia going to NATO, if you have Georgia trying to get on the NATO track, which they did, right? And now all of a sudden you have Ukraine, who was firmly in kind of the Russian camp, right? And then all of a sudden, with the Orange Revolution, seems to break away, and now all of a sudden doesn't want to be close to Russia anymore, but now wants to be close to the West and the EU and NATO. All of a sudden, if you're Putin, that is one of the last straws. So what happens is this kind of movement, I would argue, from 21 to the attacks of you have to hold on to Ukraine. If you let Ukraine go, and Ukraine joins NATO, it's going to send a significant signal to the rest that now all you have to do is kind of buy time and politically ally with NATO, and all of a sudden what's happening to your empire, it's shrinking and shrinking. And if you listen to the language that Putin is using to help justify this, right, it's about the fascists in Ukraine, right, the terrorists in Ukraine. At the same time, there are separatist regions in Ukraine, much like South Ossetia and Abkhazia, by the way. So you send irregular forces in to help establish these separatist zones, and once they solidify military control of the area, governmental control of the area, then they say, we're part of Russia now. And now Putin can say, legally those are Russian lands now. And this is going to help, well, it's not going to help, it's going to complicate the negotiations, because those lands in the separatist regions of Ukraine are officially now Russian lands. So when people talk, it's a quick, easy peace deal, the reality is Putin can't give those back because he's not allowed to give back Russian land. It'd have to go through the Duma. It'd have to be discussed and debated. And the reality is, if you're seen as a strong men don't give land back, especially to Ukraine. So again, issues. So if you have separatist regions and Ukraine seems to be creeping closer and closer towards the West, what's a young, strong empire builder supposed to do? This is a simple one. Come on, it's Putin, right? You send forces to Belarus and start a training exercise, right? And the initial entry into Belarus is about 100,000 troops, which is pretty significant if you think about it, right? By November 13th, 100,000 troops on a training exercise. Now, we were kind of paying attention to this at CGSC simply because, we like war things and we study them and we want to make sense of them. And a lot of folks that after the invasion happens, in talking to them, none of them have said, he's going to take all of Ukraine. Everyone thought, training exercise as a diversion on the Belarus border, and then he's going to push some forces into the separatist regions and hold those, much like South Ossetia and Abkhazia, right? When the full-scale invasion launches, though, everyone is like, wow, who would have thought that? And we'll get to that in a few seconds, right? because it's a bold, dashing move, right? But again, if you can get it, you can get it, right? So you can see how this is going to play out. So 100,000 troops on the border, and Antony Blinken is going to start meeting with NATO and starts warning of Russian invasion plans. What's unique about this is that you can go back and watch the nightly news and see the U.S. slowly ramping up its pressure and saying, oh, they're sharing massive intelligence with Ukraine and Western partners, and they're starting to put economic sanctions out there. So if you think about ladders of escalation, we're going to try to keep the military ladder of escalation very low from our perspective, at least from the U.S. and Western European side. But the economic one's going to go really high, the diplomatic one's going to go really high, and the information one's going to go really high. So we're playing this game of, oh, it's coming, which is unique in the fact that traditionally we kind of want to keep these things really cool and quiet. This is very well publicized, and I think it's part of the message to demonstrate that Putin is quickly becoming isolated in the global community. So he has a few friends right in North Korea, China, and Iran. Other than that, he's pretty ostracized. Oh, sorry, Belarus too, right? So that's another part of this. So you see the kind of slow, rapid pressure, and no one thinking that, oh yeah, he's going to attack. So you can kind of walk through the timeline from April to December, which is what, roughly 6 months, 7 months, right? That we're warning of them, and then we roll into 22. There's a significant effort on the U.S. and the Russian side to talk this through, but the reality is every time Russia sends a diplomat or someone to talk, they also seem to ramp up pressure in Belarus or do something that's provocative. So while they're saying, hey, yeah, we don't want war either, we're just, we want to protect Russian citizens, we want to protect those separatist regions, they want to be Russians, so that's what we're just working on, and then all of a sudden, another 5,000 troops show up, or maybe some bombers show up, or maybe a tank regiment shows up, and you're like, wait a second. The two don't always square, right? The U.S. is going to start doing some deployments around NATO too, right? NATO and the U.S. want to de-escalate in January 2022. We're also going to deploy 8,500 troops to Europe, which is significant. Remember, we're thinking about getting out of Europe, right, and kind of, reshaping that environment, and this is going to make us go back into Europe, and we're start moving forces around Europe to make sure they're in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, just in case bad things happen. President Macron from France is going to get involved and wants to mediate this thing, right, which is good. Again, from the West, it's all about cool mediation, right? We're not going to let you, push people around, but, let's be cool and diplomatic about this as we start ramping up some pressure economically, diplomatically, and informationally. But Macron can't get a deal either. On February 10th, 2022, Russia's going to launch a military exercise, which they're actually starting to move forces now from kind of staging areas to closer and closer to the Belarus-Ukraine border. It looks like an invasion may be coming, but we can still maybe hope, right? February 14th is significant in the fact that Russia claims the right to, and again, get this, to counterattack. This is much like they did in Georgia, right? That those good people of South Ossetia and Abkhazia were just minding their own business and the Georgians attacked them, right? Same thing in a separatist region. Those good Russian folks in those separatist regions were just minding their own business, declaring, their allegiance to Russia, and now the Ukrainians are provoking and attacking them. So we're going to go in, not peacekeepers this time. Well, actually, they do call themselves peacekeepers at one point. But now just to protect the rights of citizens and counterattack, which is an old Soviet strategy, right? The Soviets were never offensive-minded. They were always defensive-minded, but it's through a Marxist prism. If you assume capitalism is always on the offense, you're just playing defense, right? Although it's offense in our book. Same thing here, right? That it's the right to counterattack. U.S., by the 17th, is convinced the invasion is going to happen. Zelensky starts ramping up significant assistance from the West. On the 21st, Putin, who is being kind of quiet, by the way, in Russia, is going to make a nationalized address to the Russian people that Ukraine is part of Russia, Crimea part of Russia, which he fails to understand. Crimea was given to Ukraine by Khrushchev as a sign of goodwill. And he's like, no, it's part of Russia. We're taking it back. So kind of that counter-Khrushchev claim, right? From Biden then as a result of that, is going to start turning up the economic pressure on Russia and the Donetsk region. In fact, he signed an executive order prohibiting any economic action by any U.S. company in the separatist regions, which is significant. So when I talk about those ladders of escalation, I would argue this is kind of a high level of economic warfare, which is significant. So now, if you want to make money, you can't do it there. So I would argue at this point, we're kind of on the road to war. The rest of 22, the European Council is going to follow U.S. suits and start focusing on economic sanctions on Russia and the separatist regions, and Belarus too, by the way, right? 23rd, much like Georgia, all of a sudden, the separatists, they asked for our help. So now it's not a counterattack. Now we're just helping our good friends in the separatist regions, and our good friends in Belarus are helping us as a staging area. And February 24th, Putin is going to authorize a special military operation, and then I would argue within about an hour or two, Russian missile and artillery attacks start going off across all of Ukraine. And then later on the 24th, 25th, the attack's going to start. And the attack is going to be not just separatist regions, all of Ukraine. Which, again, if you look up here, they're going to attack from down Crimea all the way up around Kiev. And the idea from the Russian perspective, and if you kind of follow the timeline and I've listened to some of the briefings, the idea is that they thought they could take Ukraine down with anywhere from 4 to 8 days, which is pretty significant if you think about it. Yeah, it's 48 days is stunning, but they think Ukraine's going to fold. They won't get a whole lot of help from the West, and within 8 days, you can now essentially bring Ukraine back into the fold. The opening days of the attacks don't go so great. The Ukrainians fight pretty valiantly. They shoot down a bunch of transports with paratroopers. They attack some of the supply elements that are trying to help the armor and artillery formations, and Putin does not get his 4 to 8 day win. And then it starts to kind of slowly degrade into a slow attritional fight. So Putin thinks it's quick dynamic, right? Which leads to kind of this concept of really a Russian way of war, Gerasimov, right? This is Gerasimov, Chief of the General Staff. His idea is that if you can use small forces, either irregular forces and others, in short, small, dashing, aggressive means for big gains, it won't necessarily impact the nation that much, right? So minimal risk for big rewards. That's what they go into Ukraine thinking. Okay, now it's a little bigger risk up front with 100,000 plus air, artillery, missiles, rockets. But the idea is, you can have all of Ukraine. And if you can do it in 8 days, you can minimize losses, minimize impact on the people. The problem is it doesn't go that way. So I'll kind of end it here in the fact that what you end up with from Putin and Putin's wars is he thinks he's going to end up, getting a crown jewel of Russia back and a critical piece of the old Russian Empire. What he ends up with, though, is a entrenched attritional war that we're still engaged in at this point, which we can't negotiate our way out of, right? Because if you're Putin and you negotiate, what does that mean? It means you're weak. You can't give back the separatist region because that's Russian land now because you made it Russian land legally. So with this, you're kind of in a unique predicament. And if you're Zelensky, you've got the West on your side. You're getting significant help, but again, how long can you hold on? So I would argue what we're seeing is what started out as this kind of quick dynamic war to try to sail flanks and get a quick victory now has ground into a 1914-like fight where each side is kicking and screaming and clawing for minimal advances on the front. And now it's about who can hold on the longest. I don't know how this is going to end up. If the last few weeks, there's a discussion on the Ukrainian side about letting them use longer-range artillery and missiles to strike targets in Russia. We're very cautious about it because Putin came out and said, if you do that, I could provoke up to kind of either tactical nukes or strategic nukes, by the way. So he's been very kind of cagey about kind of slowly rattling that nuclear saber a few times. He did it right in the beginning when they were getting lost, when they were getting beaten back and pushed back. He started to kind of rattle that saber. He moved some tactical nukes to Belarus, by the way. Didn't use them, thank God. And now he's doing it yet again. So this is a very kind of tenacious game of brinksmanship. And I don't think it's going to end anytime soon because really neither side can afford to give up. And with that, I'll take your questions. Do we want them to come up the mics or? Yeah, I got it. Okay, all right. And here's a few readings if you want to dig deeper. I didn't put Putin's own autobiography on here simply because I don't want to give him any more money, by the way.
Question on the casualties that the Russians have had since the beginning of 2022. Compare that to what they lost in Afghanistan. Was Afghanistan pressure from inside Russia that made them leave? Was it the situation had become so bad? Is there any comparisons in what they've lost now there that might point to future?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would argue they've lost more now in Afghanistan. And much like Afghanistan, one of the pressures with Afghanistan came from mothers of Afghan vets. Specifically, when Gorbachev opens up the ability to kind of criticize the government, one of the first kind of entities that starts forming in the Soviet Union is mothers of folks that have been conscripted, and they want to know why their sons are coming home in pine boxes. And at some point, it becomes unsustainable. Something similar was happening in Ukraine, where as they conscript more and more, folks are asking questions that Putin doesn't want to answer. In fact, he doesn't want to answer anything. Any protests that get suppressed. This is part of the Prigozhin, like, okay, I can help defray costs by bringing in the Wagner group and kind of paramilitary contractors and stuff like that. So I would argue that some of the pressure is there. Afghanistan was pressure. The system was, I would argue, Afghanistan didn't collapse the Soviet Union, but it was an accelerant to help it collapse. Maybe something similar here, but unlike Gorbachev, who necessarily couldn't crack down on public pressure simply because they needed economic assistance and food assistance, Putin has no problem cracking down on it and shutting down media and keeping the West out. So I think he can kind of maybe mitigate that pressure a lot longer, possibly. So, yeah, stay tuned. I should stick to historical topics, probably, right? Let's go 1, then 2,
Okay.
and then 3 in the back.
I appreciate the cue.
What's that?
I appreciate the cue.
I'll forget the cue after the next question, probably.
I've got a question about the use of tactical nuclear weapons. I'm going to assume that from a personality perspective, Putin cannot lose this war. And I'm going to ask you to assume one of two scenarios. Either Ukraine blows up the Kerch Bridge and truly threatens Crimea, or they figure out a way to launch an effective counterattack against these eastern territories. And in either location, there is a real risk that Putin is going to lose significant territory. In either one of those situations, do you believe Putin would use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine? And if so, where would he use them?
Wow.
Thank you.
Talk about a softball question, right? Maybe, right? Because again, one of the problems with studying still living figures, right, is getting into their heads. Can I logically see him doing it? Yes. Simply because, back to that Kennan piece, I don't think he can afford to lose. So at some point, I'm sure there's some red line for him that, okay, if things start getting so bad, I can do this, this, and this. I would assume this scenario is played out for him. As far as where, I don't know, because I think the other kind of maybe variable in that is NATO response, U.S. response. So I'd like to think deterrence is working, but that doesn't mean he's not thinking about it. But right now, I think deterrence needs to kind of keep it in check. But again, this is like the third or fourth time he's done some significant saber rattling and nuclear saber rattling. So at some point, you start to lose credibility if you don't do something, right? It's like telling your kids, hey, don't make me turn this car around, right? And if you don't turn the car around, you're like, all of a sudden you're at Disneyland. They're like, yeah, we won, right? Not to equate nuclear weapons with going to Disneyland, but the idea that credibility is key. And I think credibility with his people is significant as well. There was discussion about Prigozhin and maybe the aborted coup that happened, right? Was that going to throw him out? But the reality is, if you were looking at what was going on in Russia at the time, there were a lot of folks in Russia that if they want to, take the place of Putin, they think Putin was being too cautious and slow with things. So, be careful what you ask for, that there are folks that think a more aggressive, hard-line stance is what Ukraine needs, and I could see that happening as well. I hope it doesn't. But again, this is the human dimension of war, right? Like we can make these logical assessments, but the reality is if someone's feelings get hurt and they feel like they're losing face in the international community, they may have to do something drastic. Yeah. So logically I can see it, but the passionate side of me says, no, please don't, right? And that's worked so far, I think.
Yes, I'd like to ask, how do you assess this Ukrainian offensive into the Kursk region, and how does that affect the whole scenario? You got an opinion on that?
Sure, I think it's absolutely awesome they did it. And it's comical to me because when they did it, I was like, wow, that's impressive and bold because their last offensive kind of stalled. And then what was interesting, like on the, I think it was the first week, Putin gave an address where he talked about how dare the Ukrainians launch this, terroristic offensive into our homeland. I'm like, wait a minute, like wait, and this is what studying Russia. Like I don't read fiction because I just read Russian history, right? It's even better. And the idea that wait, you're criticizing them for attacking into your country, but you invaded their whole country, and you don't see the moral equivalence of that. So I think it's good. One of the problems, though, is the deeper you attack into Russia, into that Kursk region, right, you have to hold that salient. So how much military force are you using to consolidate and hold that area versus combat power? So I think it's good. It could be a significant political bargaining chip, right? But again, back to Putin's idea of looking weak. Bold and audacious move. But we've seen also Russian gains down in the southern regions too, by the way. So at some point it's kind of 6 of one, half dozen of another. So again, we're kind of in a frozen war in many ways. It's, one side, the Ukrainians will push here, okay, they'll be checked, and all of a sudden the Russians will push here, okay, they'll be checked, and then we freeze for 6 months. So again, I just don't know how it's going to end, which is the beauty of being a historian. But it's a bold, audacious move, and that's something the Russians, I don't think, expected, and Putin specifically didn't personally expect, which is always good. Keeps them off guard. Tom?
I enjoyed your presentation very much. You've given this fascinating discussion of Putin the man and his biography and his attempt to regain imperial territory. The question is, there are 180 million Russians or something who are present for all this, and what are they thinking about it, and what are opinion leaders thinking about it? In other words, is Putin's imperial revival running basically against the current of public interest, or with the current of public interest?
I think both, right? And it's a great question that when the invasion happened and the first major call for conscripts came up, there was a mass exodus of young adults, like again, hard to get numbers, right? But anywhere from 1 to 6 million seem to leave, which would seem to indicate they're voting with their feet. But on the other side, there are also some Russians in the kind of 40 to kind of 60, 70 age demographic who are like, yes, we're back. And I think Putin's playing to those. But again, at some point when their sons and daughters start coming home, how much is it worth it? So he's very good at the old Soviet style of manipulating the press and the media to support his gains. So funerals aren't well attended. In the beginning, they were kind of done at night, and things just kind of happened. There's no big processions. There's no big deals. So there's a way of kind of downplaying that pressure as a means. So I think it's both, but time will tell. I feel like I'm giving really bad answers, but again, it's the future, right? I just don't know.
In trying to see, to put Putin in the best light and to give him the benefit of the doubt, let's say he's trying to maintain Mother Russia, the culture. Friends have brought up these points, that one or two of them you might not have addressed. One is the threat from the evil West. Mm-hmm. The fact that Crimea is the only warm water port. Now, if it's surrounded by the West, right. Wheat, large quantity of breadbasket.
Yeah, Ukraine's the
maintaining the
breadbasket.
culture and wanting to resist the evil West and its degradation. The fact that Russia's basically had Crimea and that port since about 1700.
Except for, when Khrushchev gives it to Ukraine.
Right,
But yeah.
right, and which he wouldn't have liked. The fact that eastern Ukraine has many Russians there that are Russian by Russian. You already mentioned that he would be backed into a corner, and that first map you put up, here's that blue surrounding us.
Yeah.
And the fact that Ukrainians aren't angels either. Some people have said they're very corrupt. Any of those ring a bell?
Yeah, all of them ring a bell. I mean, the reality is, if you follow really to do this justice, we probably need to meet for the next 8 weeks for 3 hours at a time, and we can discuss this more thoroughly on just the 1990s, right? That Ukraine are no angels either, right? Ukraine wanted to give up their nuclear weapons, as did Belarus, by the way, in the 1990s, with an agreement that, okay, we'll slowly bring you on the track to the Partnership for Peace, and maybe, wink, wink, maybe into NATO, right? But one of the staging kind of discussions was the first thing you have to deal with is all your corruption, by the way. So all this discussion, we're going to bring them into NATO. There was a plan to bring them into NATO, right? But they had to meet these kind of steps on, getting right with kind of the NATO standards and, being a good democratic, republic, maybe not republic, but good Democrats. But they could never get the corruption and crime under control, which is a problem, right? And one of the other issues on the Putin side, looking at best light, I'm not a fan of Putin. But the reality of if you're trying to bring Ukraine back, I think one of his significant issues, and I can't believe he got this so wrong, like he underestimates the Ukrainian perception of Russians. Yeah, the ethnic Russians, oh yeah, come on in, right? But the reality of Ukrainians have no great love for Russians, by the way. Though they share common culture and heritage, there's not a whole lot of love there. And the fact that the minute you invade, the minute you spark that passion, which for a guy who seems pretty smart, by the way, I'm like, that's a huge assumption to get so wrong. And I don't know how you get over that. But you make fair points about, wheat and access to Crimea. This is all part of that big game, right? I think he definitely wants Ukraine to come back in to help maintain that empire. The problem is that may be a 1990s dream, not a possible dream in 2024 or beyond. Okay, then we'll go 1, 2 after Jeff.
Yeah, would you fit the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict into this mess? Everything was going along so well.
Yeah, colleague, thank you for another easy question. I think it is, because I think it's part of understanding how war has been adapting, right? And the idea that we have these former Soviet republics now fighting one another, and Nagorno-Karabakh has always been that kind of tension flashpoint between the two. I think it's part of the long list of putting this 50-minute talk together, right? What do you include from the 1990s to today? Nagorno-Karabakh, right? Azerbaijan probably deserves to be in there because we're paying attention to that. That has some influence too, because the Russians are watching it and assisting sides too. So I think it's part of one big, long understanding of kind of the Russian way of war in the 21st century. We can talk more tomorrow morning at work.
My question concerns the U.S. military. I have a nephew that's in the Rangers, and he just got deployed to Europe, and he's convinced he's going to end up in Ukraine.
I think right now, no, the rotations are in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, all right, and they're just rotating kind of normal force rotations around. I have some former students who were in the 5th Corps headquarters, went over there, 2 years ago, and they're just kind of doing training missions with partners in the nations. Now, if you talk to them one-on-one, I have a former student who I just talked to about 2 weeks ago, they do think things are ratcheting up. And, of course, their expectations at some point you may have to go, but they don't seem to think it's that imminent yet. And I don't know. I think the U.S. is doing a good job of trying to be steady and cool with this, right? Because again, it's a touchy subject because you don't want to provoke Putin too much because if you do, you don't know what he's going to do, right? If all of a sudden NATO stands up and says, yes, we're going in, right? We're going to throw him out. That would give Putin, I think, significant cause to say, oh, okay, awesome, now I'm going to nuke you. I mean, so it's this very subtle game of kind of brinksmanship and, how far can I push without, making sure they're going to go off the deep end. So I don't know, but they seem to think they're planning if and when, maybe, right? But hoping they don't have to. And I think the official policy is don't go. Any more softballs? Easy?
Just going forward, is there any way that you see that the world or we can allow him to save face to get his exit out of this? And will the elections, do you think they have any bearing on it?
Our elections? I don't even want to touch that one. No, and I've racked my brain and talked with all kinds of folks that are much more informed than I are, that spend time there and read Russian traffic every day. I thought maybe in the first year, maybe there was a come to senses when things weren't working out and it seemed like the Russians were starting to grind to a halt and maybe they weren't able to get the conscripts they needed. But if you look at Russian history and the way the Russians have fought, they're very good at playing defense. They're very good at playing attrition, and they're very good at building kind of whole cloth out of nothing. And with this amount of time into it, I don't see an easy, simple political solution. Being a historian, I think it makes you somewhat pessimistic too, so that's what's tainting that too, though. All right, I'm getting to wrap it up, so if there's more questions, I can stick around and we can take them one-on-one, fair enough? But thanks for being great sports. Have a great afternoon.